me?
I'm Dan Leach. Worked with the Schiller Institute here in Houston for many years. And I'm going to be, along with some of my collaborators, we're going to help me out, present to you just a glimpse into the beautiful world of classical poetry, and hopefully give you an appreciation of what we mean by classical poetry, what it does and why this is important. You know, from the earliest times of mankind's existence, of what we know of civilization, human beings have always attempted to portray in words or in sound, music, in language, the inexpressible, that which always seems to be lying beyond what is capable of being expressed in mere words. We've all experienced this in our lives, where we're grasping for a concept, and it always seems to be beyond words. But you know, this striving of human beings to express the inexpressible in words, even though it is not always achieved, the footprints of that process is what we call poetry. And the greatest moments of this attempt to express the inexpressible has given us all the most beautiful and profound poetry that we know today, some of which you're going to hear today a little bit. And I would agree with Shelley, whose defense of poetry is part of the title of this presentation. It's also a good deal of the ideas from which I've drawn the idea for this, because he says even though most of what we call poetry is measured speech, it has meter and rhythm and all these things that we learned in school and everything, though, but broadly considered, poetry has to be considered anything which touches upon this infinite capacity in the human soul and brings it forth and inspires it. This is why every great philosopher, think of Plato, every great religious leader, think of Muhammad, of Jesus, of Buddha, every great political leader, reformer, they were all poets. You know, you can't listen to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address without being moved by the poetry of it. And although what we're going to be hearing today are, for the most part, measured poems, you know, that have meter and rhythm and all that. But keep in mind that poetry is beyond the mere writing down of poems. It's whenever human beings are inspired by this greatness within themselves. Now, there's a paradox in this, because if indeed all that we know in human culture is expressed ultimately in words, in our language, and everybody knows this language. You know, we have a common language. Ours is English. Other people have their language. How does anything new ever get expressed if all that you know is what's in your language, and you're speaking that language to another person? How do you generate any new idea that can move civilization forward? This is the paradox of language itself, and it's what poetry, I believe, which is why it is so important and special, because what poetry does is it counterposes ideas that we have in language that don't seem to fit. It creates a paradox in the mind by comparing something to something else, for example, which can be a simile or can take a number of forms. But by comparing two things that we know but don't seem to fit and that make you think about something different, that's something different. That higher idea that's created out of a paradox in language, that's what's called a metaphor. That word gets bandied about and misused a lot today. But that's what a metaphor actually is. It's a paradox that creates in the mind of the person whom it's being communicated to an idea that has no, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, you can't see it, but you know in your mind that you're thinking the same thing that the person who posed this paradox or this metaphor to you was thinking. Now, this is what actual human communication, this is the most important aspect of human communication, occurs when we're doing this thing called metaphor. It's how we actually, in fact, it's how ideas are actually communicated from one person to another. We'll see how this works when we get to the actual poems themselves. When this is done in a form in which it is calling up images that are shared images among people, whether from nature or from the emotions or whatnot, and we are sharing, whether it's with another person in actual human speech, or whether it's through a musical idea, we hear it in, as the words in a song, or whether it's reading on a page something that somebody wrote hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, but yet we know that we're experiencing an idea that was in the mind of another human being and feeling the same thing that they're feeling. There's a pleasure associated with this that Shelley says, and our sort of reigning deity, I think it's Schiller, for whom we named Schiller, who had more profound things to say about poetry than anyone else besides Shelley. But that it is when we are doing this and we feel the pleasure associated with sharing ideas with another human being, that this is the highest pleasure. This is a greater pleasure than we get out of the senses, that we get out of just seeing pleasant things, or feeling pleasant things, or tasting pleasant things. Although one of the paradoxes in poetry is that it's often by portraying pleasures of the senses and some of the paradoxes involved in them that we actually experience an idea. But the experience of that idea is what poetry is all about. In a concentrated and ordered and deliberate form, that's what I would say poetry is. Although you can, as I said, often a sentence in a speech or a piece of written prose, and sometimes even a single word, can communicate this, spark of this divine quality that human beings have. Now, I won't say a great deal more than that, because I'd like to actually get to what we're going to do today. We're going to hear a few selections from a few of the great poets in the English language, and one from the Bible, which will be actually the first one. Although, I'll introduce it in this way. Kesha is going to recite 1 Corinthians 13, which most of you will recognize as a very famous passage from the Bible. But the interesting thing about this was that this is from the King James translation of the Bible. And the people who did these translations for King James, who did this right after, I believe, Shakespeare had just died. The culture from which they drew these poets and writers that collaborated to translate the Hebrew and the Greek into English, the English that they were speaking and writing is the English of Shakespeare. So it's infused with poetry. The poetry of Paul, the ideas and the poetry of Paul's mind, through the prism of the great English Renaissance of the Shakespearean period. So the first thing we'll hear is Kesha Rogers, 1 Corinthians 13.
1 Corinthians 13, the Apostle Paul to the Corinthians. speak with the tongue of men and of angels, and have not love, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, and have not love, I am nothing. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not love, it profiteth me nothing. Love suffereth long, and is kind. Love envieth not. Love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Love never faileth. But whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now, we see through a glass darkly. But then face to face. Now I know in part. But then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now, abideth faith, hope, love, these three. But the greatest of these is love.
This is a very good transition into the next poem which we're going to hear, because it is indeed by Shakespeare, one of his sonnets. We did for those who've never read Shakespeare's sonnets, it's a very rewarding experience. We had our poetry group that we used to meet regularly here and study these and recite. We actually set ourselves the task of going through the entire 130-something sonnets, discussing and reading them together and reciting them. I think we got through 100 or so of them. But you see over the development of the most profound notion of love. What Shakespeare does is he brings together this universal kind of love that Paul discusses and makes it concrete by addressing another human being. It could be any human being. There's all this stuff that they're constantly being written about. Who is he talking about? Was it a man? Was it a woman? Was he homosexual? Was he Catholic? Was he Protestant? But it's nonsense, because what he's talking about is this universal quality of love, or what the Bible calls agape, and making it concrete and discussing all the ways in which this changes the heart and and of the poet. So Marcia Bowen is going to recite this sonnet number 29. It's one of the most famous ones and one of the most loved ones, and I think you'll see why. It's why it's so popular.
Sonnet 29. When, in disgrace of fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me more like one, more rich in hope, featured like him possessed with friends, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark, at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. But thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to trade my state with kings.
Now we're going to take a little bit of a detour, at least culturally, because although what you're going to be hearing next is in English, it is by an Indian poet. Craig will say a few words about this remarkable person, who I was not aware of until just a few years ago. He wrote in Bengali, his native language, but he also translated some of his poems into English because he also spoke English, as many people in India do. So this is a good translation because he did it himself. So Craig, you want to say a few brief words about Tagore?
Rabindranath Tagore lived from 1861 to 1941. And he was at the center in Bengal, which is today's Bangladesh and East India, of something called the Bengal Renaissance. He is best known as a poet and a composer of songs. The Indian national anthem was composed by him, and the poem I'm going to read today is one of his most famous poems from a book that he wrote in Bengali in about 1910. So it was about 50 years old, called Gitanjali, which means spiritual songs. He, by that time, had become a collaborator of Gandhi and an Indian nationalist, and was determined to uplift the largely illiterate population of India with these songs, which he was a universal thinker more than just an Indian poet, and it becomes clear when you hear his words. And the impact that he traveled to England just after he wrote this, and he translated this one work from Bengali into English while he was on the ship. He got to England, and the English literati at the time, we're talking about just before World War I, was so overwhelmed by the quality of spirit of this. And I want to just say that he was part of a sect called the Brahmano, which comes from the Hindu Brahmins, but believed in one God. And you'll see this in the poem, and it's in all these poems because they're spiritual songs. And these are all prayers to God from many different angles. This is the most famous of them. Mind without fear. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out striving, stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
It's a perfect example of poetry applying to the political realm, and what a dedication to mankind and to your nation as a vehicle for the improvement of mankind ought to be, what actual patriotism ought to be. And I think Tagore is a beautiful example of that. The next thing we're going to hear is by Schiller, in which he probably, in a more concentrated form than anything I know of, discusses the essential ingredient of what it is that must be unlocked in human beings in order to inspire them to do great things, to be the patriots of their nations, to be good human beings, to serve their fellow man, these things that we so much admire. What is, as we see today, I have to say that the thing we are lacking most in our culture today is hope, is actual optimism and hope for the future. We've become a despairing society. We've become a society of pessimists and cynics, and you see it in everything we're experiencing in our culture today. Schiller was dealing, although nowhere near a degraded level, with a similar phenomenon in his time. And he knew, and he said in his aesthetical letters, he discussed this at great length, what it would require to actually educate the ideas and the emotions of the people of his time, to make them worthy of the task required to transform society. Because Schiller had just seen what happens when you have a great moment in history, like we have today, when everything is possible. This is the French Revolution. The American Revolution had just happened. Then you had the French Revolution. But because the French people were very much in the same kind of psychological state that the American people were in right now, enraged, victimized, and the culture was so degraded and rotten, it turned into an absolute bloodbath. And virtually everything rotten politically we've been experiencing since the French Revolution has been based upon the kind of evil process that was unleashed during the French Revolution, the terror in particular, communism, fascism, it all kind of comes out of this thing. So when you hear Schiller, it's not just a paean to a lovely emotion. He's discussing a very real problem and how to address this. So John Jambor is going to recite "To Hope" by Freidrich Schiller.
Hope, Friedrich Schiller. All people discuss it and dream on end of better days that are coming. After a golden and prosperous end, they are seen chasing and running. The world grows old and grows young in turn, yet doth man for betterment hope eternal. 'Tis life, 'tis hope that delivers them into life. Around the thousand void does it flutter. The youth is lured by his magic rife. It won't be interred with the elder, though in his coffin he ends his worry lope, yet upon that coffin he plants his hope. no empty, fawning deceit, begotten in the brain of a jester, proclaimed aloud in the heart is it. We are born for that which is better. And what the innermost voice conveys, the hoping spirit never that betrays.
I was going to read a longer quote from Shelley. I think I won't for time reasons do it, but I would like, before I present the last poem on our program here, to read you a very short passage from Shelley's Defense of Poetry, which inspired Lyndon LaRouche as a young man. He, in many of his writings, he will cite a sentence from this work, which conveys, I think, exactly the sentiment that we just heard from Schiller as well. This is towards the end of it. He says, "The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the minister. But even while they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated upon the throne of their own soul." It isn't, no, that's it. And that's what we, when we engage in, in sharing poetry and poetic ideas with each other, it's the faith that exists in people, that power seated on the throne of their own soul, that we're engaged, we are sort of committing an act of faith that we know that human beings are capable of this. If we ever lose that, we're lost. So I would like to close by reciting one of my favorite poems. Many of you will probably recognize it. Maybe you studied it many years ago. It's To a Skylark by Shelley. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire, the blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. In the golden lightning of the sunken sun, o'er which clouds are brightening, thou dost float and run like an unembodied joy whose race has just begun. The pale purple even melts around thy flight. Like a star of heaven in the broad daylight, thou art unseen, but yet I hear thy shrill delight. Keen as are the arrows of that silver sphere whose intense lamp narrows in the white dawn clear, until we hardly see and feel that it is there. All the earth and air with thy voice is loud, as when night is bare from one lonely cloud, the moon rains out her beams and heaven is overflowed. What thou art, we know not. What is most like thee? From rainbow clouds that flow not drops so bright to see as from thy presence showers forth a rain of melody. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears that he did not. Like a high-born maiden in a palace tower, soothing her love-laden soul in secret hour with music sweet as love, which overflows her bower. Like a glowworm golden in a dell of dew, scattering unbeholden its aerial hue among the flowers and grass which screen it from the view. Like a rose embowered in its own green leaves, by warm winds deflowered, until the scent it gives makes faint with too much sweet those heavy-winged thieves. Sound of vernal showers on the twinkling grass, rain-awakened flowers, all that ever was joyous and clear and fresh, thy music doth surpass. Teach us, sprite or bird, what sweet thoughts are thine? I have never heard praise of love or wine that panted forth a flood of rapture so divine. Chorus, hymeneal, or triumphant chant, matched with thine, would be all but an empty vaunt, a thing wherein we feel there is some hidden want. What objects are the fountains of thy happy strain? What fields or waves or mountains? What shapes of sky or plain? What love of thy own kind? What ignorance of pain? With thy clear keen joyance, languor cannot be. Shadow of annoyance never came near thee. Thou lovest, but never knew love's sad satiety. Waking or asleep, thou of death must deem things more true and deep than we mortals dream. How could thy notes flow in such a crystal stream? We look before and after, and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell the saddest thought. Yet, if we could scorn hate and pride and fear, if we were things born not to shed a tear, I know not how thy joy we ever should come near. Better than all measures of delightful sound, better than all treasures that in books are found. Thy skill to poet were, thou scorner of the ground. Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. Such harmonious madness from my lips would flow, the world would listen then, as I am listening now. That's it. If anybody's got any questions.
What's the sentence that Leach quotes from there?
The power to impart and receive profound conceptions concerning man and nature. That it's during periods of great upheaval, great, think of when the Berlin Wall came down, or any period of great political change, that there's a power of communicating ideas that seems to be so much greater than other times. People know, it's as if they know what the other person's thinking because they're all being inspired by the same idea that seems to float above the heads of everyone. It sometimes can be almost an eerie experience because it seems like like there's a vibration going on or something like that.
That's what Helga was talking about, the Jasta with the Congress.
Yeah. Well, I was going to mention earlier, I forgot. This is what Terry Strada, one of the leaders of the organization of the families of the 9/11 victims, whose leadership was so crucial in moving the Congress to pass JASTA and then to override this presidential veto, which was such this was a monumental historical achievement. But she's told one of our colleagues that through this entire process, she had Mozart's Requiem ringing in her ears.
Ah, beautiful.
So, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with the power of what Shelley's talking about, the creative spirit that rules our universe. God, call it God, mediated through Mozart, who's dying and who writes the Requiem, the profundity of which is recognized by our movement because we are who we are. We give this gift, to the people of the New York City area on the anniversary of the 15th anniversary of 9/11. That inspires her and her friends it gives them the strength and the courage and the spiritual, wherewithal to fight this battle. It moves people who are not, as Shelley said, though they deny and abjure, they nonetheless have to abide by the power of, residing on the throne of their own souls. Most of these people in the Congress who did the right thing had no idea really what they were doing. They were responding to the strength of this powerful idea. So I think we saw a good example just within the recent weeks of exactly what Shelley's discussing, both in his prose work I quoted and in that poem.
One thing I found interesting, I often prefer to read poetry to myself than I do to hear it spoken aloud, because people often have this tendency to recite poetry in a way where they develop this faraway voice, and it's so over nice, and it actually distracts me from listening to the words. And one of the things I thought was so interesting about the poetry here today is, in a sense, how conversational it was. That there was a relationship between the ideas being spoken and they were being spoken, even though they had a quality to them which was sung in effect. It was so I thought that was very interesting, and I want to know if that was something that was done on purpose or if that was thought
Done by us?
Yeah.
We've worked on that. Yeah, I mean, we've worked to try to, not sound like, dare I say, stick up the what. But it's, if you want to hear how bad it can get, go online sometime on YouTube and type in to a Skylark, and you hear one after another of these, "Hail to thee, bad spirit." That's one of the reasons why Americans get so down on poetry, is they think of these stuffy, academic Brits or their imitators in America that have taken over classical. I mean, that's the problem with until recently with classical music, classical poetry, classical art. It's been the purview of these, these culture maidens, and Shelley, I know, and Schiller, and certainly Keats, and all these great people. They wanted to make this the passionate, fare of everyday human life. They wanted to infuse infuse it in every aspect of life, like eating, and drinking, So I encourage people to dig out their old poetry books or get a new one and read some of these beautiful poems by Keats. Keats and Shelley are two of the most accessible ones. The English is closer to our English, but I thought the way Marshall recited the Shakespeare certainly showed that it can be Shakespearean English and still be very, very real and accessible.
Yeah, Shakespeare's.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Are you saying that they would have started to speak like Shakespeare, like Shakespearean works at the English court or something like that? Or?
Who knows what it sounded like? There weren't any recording devices at the time, but certainly written English was, at its high point, I would say, during the English Renaissance, the Tudor. It's called the Tudor Renaissance, which is why the King James Bible is so beautiful. If you read that section in any other translation of the Bible, it's like milk toast. That's poetry. Had we had time, I was going to actually have somebody recite Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, because that is a piece of prose delivered as a speech, but it's infused with the most intense poetry. Anything else?
What was Susan Spiker's favorite?
Oh, Susan's was When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. It's a sign of that.